Chapter 18. When Shrimps Learn to Whistle. Freedom just became a series of cliches. The cliche, not all societies that seem free are as free as they seem. The cliche dubious, freedom is indivisible. Dwight MacDonald, 1956. Attention, dear listeners, you will hear now the manifesto of the Federation of Hungarian Writers. This is the Federation of Hungarian Writers. To every writer in the world, to all scientists, to all writers' federations, to all scientific associations, to the intellectual elite of the world, we ask you all for your help and support. There is but little time. You know the facts. There is no need to give you a special report. Help Hungary. Help the Hungarian people. Help Hungarian writers, scientists, workers, peasants, and our intelligentsia. Help, help, help. Sunday, 4th November, 1956. At 8:07 a.m., minutes after broadcasting this message, Radio Budapest fell silent. Pouring into the capital under cover of night, the Soviet army had begun its brutal suppression of the October uprising. Over the next few months, 15,000 Hungarians would die, and 5,000 would be arrested without trial. As its tank divisions rolled down the central boulevards of Budapest, it was as if the Soviet Union was punishing the world for passing such bad judgment on her. Stalinism is dead? Long live Stalinism. After a decade of plotting and analyzing and collecting intelligence and drawing up strategies for the liberation of the captive nations of Europe, America now stood immobile and apparently aghast at this flexing of Soviet muscle. The Hungarian revolutionaries died, despairing of the free world, which was willing to share their triumph but not their struggle, wrote a bitter Manes Sperber on 11th of November. But with the simultaneous Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Suez, Eisenhower found himself stuck in the moral mud, circumscribed by the cruelly obvious parallels of imperial aggression. But it was not just Suez which paralyzed America. Whilst government strategists and intelligence supremos had spent years scheming for just such an event as the Hungarian uprising, it was as a chimera, an abstract game which turned out to be all but useless in the face of reality. Operation Focus, by which the CIA believed itself to be scrutinizing Hungarian affairs since the early 1950s, turned out to be hopelessly blurred. Lawrence de Neufville, who had been assigned to Radio Free Europe in 1954, remembered that in his first month there he had asked, "What happens if a man in a raincoat comes here and says, 'We've been listening to all this stuff, and we're ready to start a revolution'?" They discussed it in a special board meeting, and they didn't know what to do. It was a house of cards, and I told them so. They were all busy thinking they were doing good, and nobody was doing any real plotting. And then events caught up on them. During the October uprising, Radio Free Europe had repeatedly encouraged the insurrectionists. According to some claims, it even promised armed support, though this was, and still is, vigorously denied by the CIA. But according to de Neufville, the agency was in no position to make such denials because, unbelievably, it had no idea what the Hungarian section was actually broadcasting. The whole thing was a sham and a delusion, he explained. Radio Free Europe was regularly sending guidances to Washington and Munich about its broadcasts, but it was just all mud in your eye because they simply ignored their own guidances. Moreover, the U.S. government had an arrangement with the British for the monitoring and translating of broadcasts from Eastern Europe, but amazingly, nobody ever translated Radio Free Europe broadcasts. So Washington simply didn't know what was going out on their radio. The CIA shouldn't have denied the Hungarian broadcasts because they simply didn't know. The full transcripts of Radio Free Europe's Hungarian broadcasts in those crucial days of October 1956 have never been found. As the realization hit that the October Revolution had failed, thousands of Hungarians fled to Austria to escape Soviet reprisals. Pouring over the border, they made mostly for Vienna. Again, the Americans were completely unprepared. Writing to Shepard Stone at the Ford Foundation, Josselson warned that the situation involving the refugees seems to be reaching a state of intolerable chaos. Our own office in Vienna, as well as all those who have returned from there in the last few days, speak of an impending catastrophe unless some major steps are taken immediately. Also in Vienna was Frank Wisner, who had arrived from Washington just in time to witness the detritus of the failed revolution. Wisner became so emotionally distressed that he started to drink heavily. By the time he got to his next stop, Rome, the local CIA men there were struggling to get him through drink-sodden evenings. In Athens, he ate some raw clams, from which came hepatitis, high fever, and delirium. Wisner's family and friends attributed his eventual decline as Allen Dulles' chief deputy to the emotional confusion of that autumn. Increasingly irritable and irrational, in 1958, he had a nervous breakdown and was replaced as Dulles' deputy, 5. Melvin Lasky was also quickly on the scene, dashing back and forth from Vienna to the Hungarian border in a state of high excitement. Whilst Wisner found himself in a personal Gethsemane, Lasky was flushed with the satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled. "Hungary, well, that did for us," he recalled brightly. "I mean, you didn't have to pay a penny for it. It was the justification for the analysis, for our analysis, which said that totalitarianism is all a farce, and it placed freedom, bourgeois freedom, firmly on the agenda." Joining forces with Friedrich Torberg, whose Forum office became the impromptu headquarters for the Congress's Hungarian campaign, Lasky set up a register for refugee intellectuals and students and worked to find them places in European universities, at a rate of 15 a day. He also started compiling a dossier of documents, with help from his friends at Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. La Révolution Hongroise, a white book published in England by Secker and Warburg and in the U.S. by Prager. In Paris, the Congress came into its own, its offices at Boulevard Haussmann heaving with people. It was a high point of tension and passion. It was incredibly exciting. Like this was what we were there for, said John Hunt, who had arrived at the Congress only a few months earlier. Calling into play its extensive network of contacts and affiliates, the Paris office coordinated public protests from Santiago to Denmark, Lebanon to New York, Hamburg to Bombay. In Sweden, the local committee persuaded 8 Nobel Prize winners to sign a cable of protests to Marshal Bulganin. The American committee organized a mass meeting attended by Koestler and Salone. They wanted Hemingway and cabled Josselson for help in locating him, but he replied, "Hemingway presumably in Europe, whereabouts uncertain." By January 1957, the Paris office was able to report that never before have the actions of the various national committees been so unified or strong. Another outcome of the Hungarian crisis was the formation of the Philharmonica Hungarica, an orchestra assembled at Josselson's initiative under the musical direction of Antal Dorati, with Zoltán Rozsnyai as conductor. Rozsnyai had escaped to Vienna along with 100 members of the Budapest Philharmonic as soon as the Soviet tanks started shelling the Hungarian capital. With an initial grant of $70,000, the orchestra became a powerful focus for the Kulturkampf and still tours today. But perhaps the most exciting development for Josselson and his intellectual shock troops was the news that Sartre had publicly repudiated the Communist Party, branding the Soviet leadership a group which today surpasses Stalinism after having denounced it. Writing in L'Express on the 9th of November 1956, he denounced Soviet policy since the Second World War as 12 years of terror and stupidity, and wholeheartedly condemned the intervention in Hungary. Reserving special invective for his own country's communists, he declared, "It is not and never will be possible to resume relations with the men who are currently running the French Communist Party. Every one of their phrases, their every move, is the outgrowth of 30 years of lies and sclerosis. Their reactions are those of completely irresponsible persons." The Congress ran off thousands of copies of Sartre's statement, distributing it along with that of Camus, who threatened to lead a boycott of the United Nations if it failed to vote for the immediate withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary, and to publicly denounce its bankruptcy and failure if the UN fell short of this demand. There seems to be a breakaway of the French intellectuals in a descending order of communists, fellow travelers, progressists, anti-communists, and now anti-communist communists, 10, Josselson remarked gleefully. Louis Aragon's communist-backed Comité National des Écrivains was, he said, virtually torpedoed. It is safe to say that the communist mystique has been smashed. But he also noted that the French Socialist Party could have taken advantage of the situation were it not for the ill-fated intervention in Egypt. 11. A further truth about the Suez conflict now established itself in Jocelson's mind. It is obvious that if Europe is not to succumb, it has to become independent of its Middle Eastern oil sources, he told one correspondent. A program of intensified scientific research for the replacement of oil by other sources of energy may be the answer. 12. Specifically, Jochelson meant nuclear energy. Attempts to gain acceptance for atomic power had long been an American foreign policy priority. In 1952, C.D. Jackson had noted in his log files that matters were progressing on life on an article by Gordon Dean to remove the guilt complex from America on the use of the A-bomb. C.D. Jackson was also closely involved in preparing Eisenhower's famous Atoms for Peace address to the United Nations on 8th of December 1953, in which the president proposed a unilateral reduction of atomic weapons and outlined the means of diverting the military uses of nuclear power to civilian uses. Never one to miss a propaganda opportunity, C.D. Jackson submitted a memo to Frank Wisner in February 1954 in which he suggested extending the Eisenhower proposal to include the announcement of a plan to erect the first atomic power reactor in Berlin. There were, said C.D., very practical as well as propaganda reasons for doing this. Every ounce of fuel, liquid or solid, used in Berlin has to be brought into the city across Soviet territory. In spite of the reserve stocks we have accumulated, a new blockade would be very serious. An atomic power plant, he reasoned, would be able to supply the basic energy needed to take care of the city under siege conditions. The propaganda value, vis-a-vis the Germans and the Soviets, was obvious. In fact, as propaganda, it would not even be necessary to take a final decision as to the actual erection of the power plant. The idea could be leaked simply as an idea. A survey group could wander around Berlin looking for a suitable site, a rubble area could be fenced off and put under guard with mysterious signs, and the project for the time being could be limited to the rumor stage, which from the standpoint of the Berliners and the Soviet observers is almost as good as actually getting on with the work. 15. Jochelson possessed nothing close to this Machiavellian reasoning. He was genuinely taken by Eisenhower's idea of beating nuclear swords into plowshares. His motives were sincere, if naive. In a letter to Nabokov, he wrote that, "It is obviously the case that the exploitation of atomic energy will radically change the lot of mankind in society. I remain firmly convinced that it will also mark the swan song of Marxism and provide a new philosophical and sociological basis for mankind, just as the Industrial Revolution provided the basis for Marxist theories." 17. Welcoming the Eisenhower proposal to pool atomic energy resources for peaceful purposes as a stroke of genius, Jochelson was keen to promote the idea through the Congress journals, but had run up against a wall of indifference. "I have been desperately trying to have Eisenhower's proposal followed up with a series of articles in Proeves, from which they would have been picked up by other journals in Europe," he told de Neuville in January 1954. Alas, the three non-communist leading scientists in France have declined under one pretext or another. It is the usual case of a good idea not being fully exploited because people are either too lazy or too busy or just don't give a damn. Yet this is one idea that can instill new hope and confidence among some pretty desperate Europeans. Jochelson ended by saying, "If you have any ideas, please don't keep them to yourself." What happened next provides a rare insight into the workings of the clandestine bureaucracy behind the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Jochelson's letter was passed to C.D. Jackson at the White House. C.D. Jackson passed it on to Tracy Barnes at the CIA with the suggestion that William Tyler be invited to ghost this piece for the appropriate big-name European scientist. Tyler was public affairs officer at the American Embassy in Paris, though his many functions suggest that this was a cover. "Besides writing impeccable Académie French," said Jackson, "Tyler has the added advantage of having been in on many of the drafts of this speech, so that he has a complete grasp of the philosophy of the speech." Jackson told Barnes to put this idea right back to Jochelson as a matter of urgency, as the next issue of Proves was about to close. Whilst Josselson nurtured his plans for a nuclear-powered Europe united behind the concept of democratic freedom, Dwight MacDonald was in Egypt to witness Western empires behaving badly, on assignment for Encounter, whose associate editor he had just become. MacDonald, who looked, said one friend, like a mad professor with a butterfly net, was at a high point in his career. He had just finished his lengthy profile of the Ford Foundation for The New Yorker and relished the chance of working on a highbrow magazine like Encounter. So it was odd that his stint in Cairo should have failed to stimulate him into any good reportage. Indeed, when he heard a shell slamming into a building near his hotel, he upped and moved into the suburbs, where he hid for several days without contacting the Encounter office. MacDonald, who had described his arrest in 1940 for picketing the Soviet consulate in New York as great fun, seemed now to have lost his taste for risk, never once venturing out of the city to see the war zone. "We paid a couple of £100 for his ticket and paid the hotel so that Dwight could do a Suez post-mortem," recalled Lasky. But what he wrote was absolutely unpublishable. He had writer's block out there, and then he came back and would sit around the office for months at a time, and all there would be was this writer's block. MacDonald's appointment to Encounter had been controversial from the start. Josselson had never been satisfied with Kristol's editorship, and the two had clashed over what the magazine should be from the very first issue. Josselson felt that Kristol was too precious about Cold War issues and demanded more emphasis on the political side of the magazine. "We are not publishing cultural magazines with a capital C. I am disturbed about your failure to grasp this." 22. Josselson lectured Kristol in a remark which comes close to justifying one critic's comment that Encounter was a magazine of political propaganda with a cultural decor. Lasky, as ever, agreed with Josselson. "We were concerned in the mid-50s that Encounter wasn't paying enough attention to Soviet and Eastern Bloc affairs. But Kristol didn't want to do this. He had a kind of nervous, compulsive fear of ideological discussion." Despite calling Kristol to heel at a series of meetings in Paris, by early 1955, Josselson was completely exasperated. "You will remember that at our executive committee meeting, everyone was in agreement that the period spent so far by Encounter in overcoming covert and overt resistance was time well spent," Josselson wrote mysteriously, but that now it was time to go one step further. Kristol's response was hardly compliant. "Basically," he wrote, "I have to do things my way. If my way turns out to be inadequate, there's always a final solution." 25. Whilst Kristol referred idly to his own extinction, Josselson was already one step ahead, quietly instructing Nabokov and Lasky to do the rounds and ask for recommendations for a replacement editor. Isaiah Berlin, who was habitually consulted on such matters, suggested H. Stuart Hughes. Another suggestion was Philip Horton, a former OSSer and the CIA's first station chief in Paris in 1947, who now worked for The Reporter. Spender, meanwhile, was busily engaged in undermining Kristol's position. "I think it must be because he is so intensely competitive that he regards every decision as a kind of conflict in which he has to score a victory, either by keeping the decision to himself or by sabotaging it if it is made by his colleague." 26, he told Josselson, leaving him in no doubt of the benefits of removing Kristol. "If Irving goes, we can then begin discussing things which could be decided immediately, but which he turns into long, drawn-out battles." Nabokov, meanwhile, had another candidate in mind and wrote to friend and confidant Arthur O. Schlesinger to ask if he could very, very tactfully sound out Dwight MacDonald. Schlesinger was very enthusiastic. So was Malcolm Muggeridge, whose comment that Kristol was a very nice fellow, but perfectly useless and incapable of cutting any ice here, concealed what Lasky claimed was a biological hatred. He thought he was a barbarian. 28. Josselson agreed to discuss the possibility with MacDonald in New York and went to meet him there in June 1955. The two got on well, but Josselson worried that MacDonald's gadfly temperament would not be easy to house within the Congress tent. He was, said Josselson, too, lone wolf. When Sidney Hook got wind of the meeting, he threatened to resign from the executive committee and said he would blow the Congress out of the water, 29, if MacDonald were appointed. Kristall, who had been kept in the dark throughout these negotiations, was incredulous when he finally learned that MacDonald was being considered as his replacement. It was ridiculous. He was an anarchist and a pacifist, he later exclaimed. By the time of the Congress's Future of Freedom Conference in Milan, September 1955, the matter was still unresolved. During that middle week of September 1955, the delegates' hotel steamed with intrigue. Stuart Hampshire remembered more of the boudoir politicking than of the debates themselves, which were, according to Hannah Arendt, deadly boring. Whilst George Kennan was intoning on the strategy of freedom, a typical Kennan theme, freedom, like foreign policy, needed to be strategically organized, Sidney Hook's bedroom became the focus of a cell opposed to Dwight's appointment. A quick shuffle down the corridor led to Arthur Schlesinger's bedroom, which was where the faction in support of Dwight's appointment gathered. Dwight was vetoed principally by Sidney Hook, Hampshire remembered, and I saw very strongly then that there was a central control, the apparat at work. Certainly, Dwight would have been a loose cannon. You never knew what he might do or say next, and they weren't going to have it. 31, but Schlesinger dug his heels in. I supported him. So did the CIA, and they pressured Josselson to accept, which he did reluctantly. Eventually, a compromise was worked out whereby MacDonald would join Encounter for 1 year as a contributing editor, and Kristall would stay on. Writing to explain the arrangement to Muggeridge, Josselson said that he had given Kristall such a heavy dose of frank treatment bordering on brutality that a salutary change in his attitude can be expected. 33. But within months, such expectations were dashed. The sniping continued, and Josselson found himself writing in exasperation to Kristall. I could not bite your head off if you would not stick your neck out. I don't know where you draw the line between editorial criticism and issues of principle. 34, to Daniel Bell, Josselson privately confessed, I sometimes feel that Irving will change his ways when shrimps can learn to whistle. 35, Josselson had instinctively had misgivings about MacDonald. No sooner had his appointment, and a generous salary of $12,000 plus expenses, been confirmed than Dwight submitted an article to Encounter called No Miracle in Milan. His remarks on the luxurious accommodation enjoyed by the delegates and their apparent lack of concentration at the conference debates left Spender and Kristall in a spin. Contrary to what MacDonald had anticipated, before coming to London, he wrote to Spender that he was pleased as punch to hear about the Congress's attitude to Encounter. Their hands-off policy sounds positively idyllic. 36. The article was discussed with Nabokov, Bondi, Lasky, and Josselson before finally being passed back to MacDonald with a raft of suggested amendments. It was finally published in December 1955, a month after a far more respectful account by the conservative sociologist Edward Shills appeared. But this meddling was a taste of things to come. In the wake of the tumultuous events of 1956, the Congress had struck its form. Although it did not think of itself exclusively as a militant organization for ideological combat and exposure of crimes, falsehoods, and inquisition, 37, this was precisely what it excelled at. More formal arrangements for this kind of activity were completed in October 1957, when Lasky presided over the formation of the Congress's Forum Service, which offered background information and analysis to subscribers worldwide. In fact, Forum World Features, as it was renamed, was a classic CIA undercover operation, with John Hay Whitney once again acting as a front, registering the company under his name as a Delaware corporation with offices in London. By the 1960s, Forum World Features was the most widely circulated of the CIA-owned news services. Nevertheless, under Josselson's careful stewardship, the Congress continued to be seen as the only independent international organization which consistently proclaimed the value of freedom. It was a matter of creating an area of cultural freedom itself, within which the great enterprises of literature, art, and thought could be pursued, explained a Congress statement. In order to oppose a world in which everything serves a political purpose, which is for us unacceptable, it was necessary to create platforms from which culture could be expressed without regard to politics and without confusion with propaganda, where the direct concern would be for ideas and works of art in themselves. 38. This was the criterion by which the Congress ultimately would stand or fall. Of course, the propaganda imperative was never relinquished by the Congress's secret angels. Jocelson's job was to make sure that this imperative was carefully concealed, and for the moment at least, it seemed to be working. People were flocking to the Congress. If ever there were such a thing as anti-communist chic, it was now. Once again, the personal cost to Michael Josselson was high. In August 1957, he underwent a gruesome operation which involved stripping out and replacing arteries in his leg. As he recuperated, Melvin Lasky cheered him with news of the Battle of Brecht, in which the Congress ranged its artillery against communist idolizers of the communist millionaire at a conference held in Berlin, scoring another hit in German culture politic. More cheering still was the news that the Ford Foundation had confirmed a new grant of £500,000 to the Congress, and that the Rockefeller Foundation was also renewing its largesse. But the final say that year went to the Soviets as they launched the world's first successful satellite into orbit on the 4th of October. Weighing less than 200 pounds, Sputnik 1, the name meant fellow traveler, carried enormous weight in international affairs. As it bleeped across the globe, it instantly created an atmosphere of panic in the U.S. government. I guess Sputnik buries old Ike's reputation for all posterity. First in war, first in peace, first on the golf links, but second to the moon, 39 Lasky told one correspondent. When 1 month later, America's attempt to launch a much smaller satellite came crashing down to the ground in full view of the world's news cameras, the taste of defeat was bitter indeed.